fine evening. Thank you very much, Xie. It's now my pleasure to introduce the next of our panelists, the Professor of Buddhist Studies here at Oxford University, Professor Stefano Zacchetti, who is an expert on the transmission of the culture of Buddhism into China from India. So, Stefano, over to you. Do you want to come to the podium or talk from there?
What? I don't know.
We can hear you very well talking from here.
Then perhaps, yes, if I could just stay here,
yes,
if that works, good. I mean, yes, would be helpful.
And
okay.
I'll continue to chair from here.
Oh.
Please, Stefano.
Sorry that I have to stand there. Well, thank you, Dennis, for the very kind introduction. I mean, trying to guess why I was invited to this very important event, I imagine that in a sense is to provide a bit of historical background to this conversation. The title, and I apologize, I could not prepare a PowerPoint in time, but the title of my presentation in Dialogue with the Western Regions, Some Reflection on Buddhism in Chinese History. It hints, I mean, this name Western Regions, this is a translation of Chinese Xiyu, which at the time when Buddhism was first introduced into China, roughly around the 1st century of the Common Era, that was the term that it was used to refer to Central Asia and beyond. So that big area that was lying on the west of China, and whence Buddhism was introduced into the Chinese Empire. And this is a reminder of the fact that Buddhism was, after all, from a Chinese perspective, a Western thing. And also a reminder that intercultural dialogue at a very high level, I mean at multiple levels, but also of a very important kind, with the West in China did not start with Portuguese sailors, the Jesuits, or not even with Marco Polo for that matter, and let alone later on in the 19th and 20th century. But it has a very, very long history because of this long-term, highly influential, extremely important process of introduction and adaptation of Buddhism from India, from the Indian world into China, and then from China into East Asia. As I said, the earliest evidence we have of Buddhist presence in China dates to around the second half of the 1st century. And the process went on and on for many centuries, and in a sense is still going on. Buddhism by now has become a fundamental, completely assimilated aspect of Chinese culture at large. But to look at this process, that's what I'm particularly interested in. That's one of my main areas of research. It is, of course, of great historical significance. If we want to do cultural, political history of China, we have to take these into account. But I would argue that it is also important for what it can tell us concerning China of the present day, nowadays China. So it's not just of historical interest, and I will say something more about this aspect. Let me say briefly that the main features of interest that studying the history of Buddhism in China can present to the scholar basically lie in the fact that these were two very different in interesting ways, cultural complexes. Chinese civilization on the one hand, and Buddhism on the other. Buddhism, as many of you no doubt know, is perhaps the first, let's call it religion. I mean, it is not a term that does fully justice to what Buddhism is, but for just the sake of simplicity, let's call it a religion. It's the first religion that carried a message of salvation that was really, in a sense, not culturally specified. It was meant to be, it was really addressing human beings and indeed living beings at large. And what is also characteristic of Buddhism is not just these, but it had from the very beginning, from a very early stage, a comparatively highly flexible approach to the use of language and of other means of expressing ideas, images, language, and so on and so forth. Buddhism is a tradition whose message, whose text, started to be translated first in various Indian languages and then later on in other Asian languages from basically as early as we have records, is the quintessential religion of translation. And the most important, historically, the most important example is no doubt is constituted by this great project of translation of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese that started again in the mid-2nd century and then went on for many, many centuries until the Northern Song dynasty, let's say roughly around the 11th century. So it's probably we are confronted by the single most important process of translation of text, whole cultural complex in the pre-modern world. And there is a lot to learn from that. So we have this richness and particular interest of Buddhism on the one hand, and of course the fact that by moving to China, it was confronted with a civilization that at the time was already incredibly rich, with an incredibly rich tradition, literary, philosophical tradition, and also a highly organized and structured political entity. And these are all aspects that played a role in making this process particularly complex, but also fascinating and interesting to study. We have to bear in mind that with Buddhism, introduction of Buddhism into China was not just the introduction of a religion, some text, has really to be regarded as a complex, rich, multifaceted cultural complex. We are dealing with, in effect, through Buddhist, through the introduction of Buddhism, we Chinese were confronted with a whole new imagery, new ideas, new images of the world, new ways of using images, for instance. That's another aspect that has a very, very profound impact on Chinese culture. The way Buddhism made use of icons of the Buddha had a clear impact in China. So all aspects from language, literature, philosophy, material culture, the Buddhism had a very, very profound impact on China. As I said before, this is not just something that we as scholars, should be interested in from a purely historical perspective. I would argue that the Buddhist experience, so what the strategies adopted by Buddhists in order to make the text, the images, etc., understandable to the Chinese audience, and on the other hand, the reactions of Chinese establishment, at political level, institutional level, but also the cultural level, can tell us a lot about, patterns of cultural dialogue and interaction that are still in many areas continue to be in place even today. And it's very important to keep this experience in mind to better understand certain aspects, important areas of Chinese life, Chinese culture, Chinese institution. I'll give you just a couple of examples in framing in very general terms. But for example, there are ways in which in the Chinese, in modern Chinese, foreign words, loan words, are rendered that, in fact, and very few persons are aware of that, were invented many centuries ago, I mean, as I said, as early as the 2nd century, in order to translate in the Sanskrit words into Chinese. And they are still there, still used, still productive in modern Chinese. From a completely different angle, that of institutions, political institutions. This is another area which is relatively neglected in scholarship, extremely important, having to deal with Buddhism, which is, first of all, from a social, historical perspective, is a highly organized religious movement, is a highly organized institution, monastic. It comes in the forms of monastic institutions. It posed, having to deal with these, which was something completely unknown to China before Buddhism arrived, it posed a very particular challenge to Chinese institutions. And, in the long run, after, also some conflictual phases and difficult passages, a system of was produced whereby Buddhist monastic institutions were absorbed in a very interesting way by the Chinese state. And this is something that happened, was already in place basically at the beginning of the 5th century CE. That's a long while ago. And I would argue that this model of interaction with an institutional religion has shaped the way that the Chinese state, any Chinese state, including the People's Republic of China, deals with institutionalized religions. And there are very clear patterns of continuity here. And this is a reminder that also at the level of cultural interaction is extremely important. This is, of course, true of any aspect of Chinese life, to look back to better understand the present. And I close here. Thank you for your attention.
Well, Professor Zacchetti, thank you for compressing 2,000 years into 12 minutes. A remarkable achievement. We'll go on to the other contributions from the panelists and then open up for discussion. And my pleasure now is to introduce Professor Michael Dobson, who's going to bring a very different cultural influence to bear on the discussion, because he is director of the Shakespeare Institute.
Thank you very much.